My dad handed the $5.5 million rupees empire I built to my useless brother because he's the only son. So I walked away and gave them an ending they'll regret forever. My name is Isabella Romano, and I am 34 years old, born and raised under the dry heat of North Texas. I am the CEO of a multi-million-dollar landscape construction company specializing in designing, building, and maintaining outdoor spaces for commercial properties, upscale residential communities, and urban parks. It may sound simple when I say it, but if there is one thing I have learned from the soil, the water, and the irrigation pipes buried beneath the grass, it is this. Anything beautiful and lasting must be laid on a foundation built early, through discipline, through hands willing to get dirty, and through decisions that no one else ever sees. I still remember a sentence carved into my mind like the sharp line of a shovel across freshly leveled ground. A daughter should stay at home and tend to the kitchen. This company will go to my only son. My father did not say that once, but over and over, long enough to turn it into an unwritten family law. He was the kind of man who believed the world worked best when everyone stayed in their so-called natural place. For him, my place was behind the kitchen door, while the place of the business, the decision-making, the final signature on every contract, belonged to the son. It may sound old-fashioned, but even in modern Texas, prejudice knows how to disguise itself as tradition to survive. And that prejudice found a permanent home in our one-story house on the outskirts of Dallas throughout my childhood. My older brother, Anthony Romano, 4 years my senior, grew up in constant indulgence, like a lawn watered on schedule and trimmed to perfection, never once exposed to the harsh sun. He attended private school for a while, then drifted from plan to plan, like a man wandering the aisles of Home Depot, unsure which fertilizer to buy because he had never planted anything himself. Anthony was quick with words, always knowing exactly what to say to please my father and accustomed to others clearing the path before him. Dropping out of school never became a problem because my father was always ready to call it a break to find the right direction. I did not hate him, at least not in a fiery way. I simply learned to acknowledge the truth as it was. Anthony had been placed under a constant drip of water, while I had to learn how to survive in the blazing heat. I was different. From a young age, I was quietly yet persistently belittled short remarks, clipped like pruning shears. Girls have weak hands. Steel toe boots look rough on you. Don't go to the site too often. Your skin will darken. But it was exactly those condescending looks that made me want to touch everything. I loved riding in the back of the truck, breathing in the damp smell of soil, asking Michael, my father's veteran foreman, about the water pressure in the pipes, about why that oak tree needed a thicker layer of mulch in autumn, about how to schedule maintenance so it wouldn't fall on rainy days. I was fascinated by blueprints, by the transformation of a bare lot into a stone-paved walkway, into rows of seasonal flowers, into a smart irrigation system linked to sensors. I loved the things others dismissed as dirty, heavy, or exhausting, because in them I saw a quiet, honest order. If you respect the land will give you back what you ask for. Of course, love alone was never enough to convince my father. I still remember vividly a spring morning when I was 11, the day my science teacher announced the results of the District Innovation Fair. My project, a homemade drip irrigation model built from leftover PVC pipes and recycled water bottles, had won first prize. I remember the moment the whole class applauded when my teacher placed a shiny little bronze medal in my hand and said, "Isabella, you have the vision of a real engineer." My heart nearly leapt out of my chest as I ran home clutching that certificate, longing for my father's embrace, hoping he would finally see that his daughter was capable of something meaningful. But when I handed him the award, he barely glanced at it, gave a faint smile, then folded it and set it aside on the dinner table. He said, "Well, that's nice, but you're a girl, what use is all that? In the end, you'll still be in charge of the kitchen, and this company will have to go to Anthony." The most painful part of that moment was when I looked into my father's eyes and saw the indifference so clearly. It wasn't that he didn't hear me, and it wasn't that he didn't understand. It was that in his mind, a wall had already been built. No matter how hard I tried, he would always see it as nothing more than a child's game. I stood there frozen, then quietly took my certificate back to my room, telling myself I would fold it carefully and keep it for myself, because my father would never see it as anything significant. Yet that very same evening, when Anthony, then 15, scored a goal in a school soccer tournament, my father's voice shook the bleachers as he shouted with pride. He ran down to hug him, and the next day he even hosted a big party, inviting the neighbors over to celebrate his son's victory. I sat at the table, quietly eating a slice of pizza, listening to their laughter, listening to my father brag again and again. My son has the spirit of an athlete. He's bound for success. He'll carry this family on his shoulders one day. No one asked about my certificate. No one remembered that just a few hours earlier I too had achieved something remarkable. My mother, Linda, loved me, but she was powerless against my father's rigid, patriarchal ways. I still remember that night after the party, when she sat on the edge of my bed, placed her hand on my shoulder, and whispered, "Sweetheart, don't be sad. I see all your effort. I believe what you're doing will take you much further than a soccer goal ever could." I nodded, eyes stinging, but inside me there remained an emptiness that words could not fill. My mother could comfort me, could hold me close, but she could not change the heavy scales of this household. In that balance, the son was always the center, while the daughter remained on the margins. Scenes like this repeated throughout my childhood, like a wound cut open again and again until it's scarred over. When I won a speech competition at school, my father said, "A girl who talks too much will have trouble finding a husband." When I was chosen to lead a science project, he dismissed it with, "It's just a school game, nothing worth bragging about." But when Anthony brought home even the smallest certificate for physical education, my father proudly taped it to the refrigerator door as if it were a great conquest. I did not resent my brother, because he never set out to hurt me. The truth was, Anthony was so accustomed to favoritism that he accepted it as natural. But it was this invisible comparison that taught me a harsh lesson. In my father's eyes, my gender had already determined my worth long before I ever had the chance to prove anything. There were summer afternoons when I followed my mother into the backyard to water the rows of tomatoes and peppers she planted. I held the hose, watching the stream soak into the soil, trickle into the small trenches she had dug, and I silently wished my father could see my efforts the way my mother looked at those seedlings, believing that with enough light and water, they would grow into strong, steady plants. But my father was different. To him, I was only the woman of the family, destined to study just enough before marrying, raising children, and tending the kitchen fire. Anthony was the heir, even though he never showed the slightest interest in the family business. Those years, I lived in a cruel paradox. The more I proved myself, the more my father ignored me. The lazier Anthony became, the more excuses my father found for him. When Anthony failed a class, my father said, "It's fine, sons always have many paths to take." When I earned an A in advanced math, he responded half-heartedly, "What does a girl need math for? It's not like you'll be calculating anything complicated." I gradually learned to swallow those words, to turn them into fuel. Instead of crying or arguing, I quietly promised myself that I would carve my own path, a path that one day would force him to acknowledge me, whether he wanted to or not. Looking back, I realized that childhood was like a harsh training ground where I had to learn to stand tall without applause, to comfort myself when achievements went unnoticed, to turn disregard into a slow-burning fire. My mother, though she could not overturn my father's beliefs, was my only anchor. She reminded me that true worth never came from my father's praise, but from my own belief in myself. And from those years, I began to understand that one day, I would have to prove my father wrong, not with words, but with an entire career he could never deny. When I was 16, my high school held a ceremony honoring the top students across the state. It was the first time my name had ever been called on such a big stage, with an academic record ranked in the top 1% of the entire region. I remembered the countless nights I had stayed up studying, preparing presentations, and taking dozens of practice exams. To me, that moment was more than just a certificate. It was a rare chance for my father to feel proud of me, to see that his daughter could stand shoulder to shoulder with anyone, maybe even rise above. I had sent him the invitation, printed out the program, even placed it on the breakfast table where he sat every morning. I imagined him in the audience, watching me walk across the stage, nodding in recognition, even if only once. But on that day, as I stood under the bright lights on stage, my eyes swept over the audience and landed on a chilling emptiness. The seat reserved for my parents was still vacant, not a single person sitting there. My heart plummeted. After the ceremony, my mother called to apologize, saying her hospital shift had run late. I felt no anger toward her, because I knew she had truly wanted to be there. My father, however, had chosen to take Anthony to a casual soccer game in Dallas, a meaningless match, yet in his eyes, it was more important than his daughter's education. When I heard that, it felt as though my entire world had collapsed. That night, I came home, slipped off the nicest dress I had picked out for that special day, and shut my bedroom door tight. For the first time in years, I broke down sobbing. It wasn't only because my father had missed the ceremony, it was because I suddenly realized the truth. I could work twice, 3 times as hard, but in his eyes, I would always remain an outsider. My pillow grew wet with tears as I curled up, wishing I could disappear. In that moment, I felt small, useless, and powerless against the shadow of favoritism my father always cast over Anthony. My mother knocked gently before entering, then sat beside me and held me in her arms. The faint scent of her perfume on her blouse soothed my grief like a sedative. She didn't say much, only whispered, "You must be strong, Bella. You must prove your worth, even if your father never acknowledges it. Sometimes, it's not because you're not good enough, but because some people refuse to see the truth. But you have to keep going, because, one day, the world will not be able to ignore you." I choked back tears, nodded, and in that moment, a new fire began to flicker inside me. That night, I wrote a promise in my notebook. I will never wait for my father's recognition. I will become someone the whole world must acknowledge, even him. It was the vow of a 16-year-old, naive but powerful, and it became the starting point of my determination to rise on my own merit. From that day forward, I began to change the way I looked at everything. I stopped seeking my father's approving gaze and instead focused on turning every achievement into a brick, building a path of my own. In the years that followed, I didn't stop at academic success. I joined the science club, secured sponsorships from local businesses to carry out environmental research projects, and even managed to intern at a small landscaping company in the city during the summer, where I learned to design my first smart irrigation system. Each experience stitched up the holes inside me like a needle pulling thread, turning pain into fuel. While Anthony spent his summers drifting around with friends, I gave mine to thick textbooks, long hours on construction sites, and even the sting of failed designs that didn't work as planned. Perhaps the injustice I endured within my family became an unintended catalyst. It stripped away illusions, forcing me to stop waiting for fairness from my father. I understood that if I wanted a place in this world, I would have to carve my name into stone myself without leaning, without pleading. I began to picture a different future, one where I was the one at the helm, where work was not defined by gender. And I quietly promised myself, if my father would not give me the opportunity, I would create it on my own. I carried that vow I had made at 16 with me into my college years, like a shield protecting me from the skeptical looks and dismissive words that still filled my own household. I applied to the University of Texas and chose business administration as my major. Many people were surprised, and my father even scoffed. "What's a girl going to do with business? Contracts, numbers, those things won't mean anything to you later." He spoke as if I had signed up for a cooking class just to pass the time. But I stayed silent, refusing to argue. Deep inside, I had already decided I would not just study business for the sake of it, I would study to become a leader. And because I knew business alone wasn't enough, I enrolled in additional courses in landscape architecture and environmental resource management. I wanted to understand both how to run a company and the language of soil, plants, and design. I wanted to hold both in my hands, management as a foundation, and technical expertise as depth. College was anything but easy. I studied while working part-time jobs to cover expenses, since my father offered almost no support. He had told me bluntly, "If you want to go to school, you pay for it yourself. The money in this house is for Anthony. He's the one who needs to prepare for the future." So I worked as a waitress at a fast food place, tutored high school students in math, and even picked up shifts at a construction supply store, where I learned how to tell one type of cement from another, one kind of brick from the next. By day, I sat in lecture halls with my worn-out laptop, typing notes from lectures on strategic management. By night, I put on a uniform, stood behind a cash register, and counted every tip carefully, just enough to pay rent and buy textbooks. There were nights when I came home late, collapsing onto my bed, both exhausted and proud because every hour I worked proved I could keep moving forward without a cent of my father's support. Meanwhile, my brother Anthony was the complete opposite. After enrolling in an expensive private university in Dallas, he lasted only 2 years before dropping out. The excuses were endless. The classes didn't suit me, the professors didn't understand me, the school didn't allow enough creative freedom. The truth was, he spent most of his time partying, drinking with wealthy friends, and burning through my father's money without a second thought. I remember once, in the middle of finals week, as I hunched over my notes in the dorms, I saw a photo he had posted online raising a glass of champagne with the caption, "Live it up, deal with tomorrow later." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. A dropout still praised by my father as someone finding his own path, while I worked myself to the bone with school and jobs, and yet never once earned his acknowledgement. In my final year of college, I chose to intern at a commercial landscaping company in Austin. There, I had the chance to work on major projects, designing irrigation systems for office complexes spanning dozens of acres, overseeing construction in luxury residential communities. I learned how to read technical drawings, calculate budgets, and negotiate with suppliers. I even joined the project management team, where for the first time I understood the true complexity of running a contract worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was an invaluable experience, opening a door that, at home, my father had never believed I was capable of knocking on. On the day of my graduation, my mother was the only one there, sitting in the audience, clapping so hard her hands turned red as I walked across the stage. My father did not come. He claimed he was busy with work, but I knew better. He was driving Anthony to meet with some supposed potential employer, which was really just an excuse for Anthony to enjoy another fine meal. By then, I didn't feel sadness anymore. I had grown too used to it. Watching my mother's tears of joy, I felt it was enough. That diploma was not meant to be shown to my father, it was proof to myself that I had kept the vow I made at 16. At 22, I returned to Dallas. My father's company at the time was just a small landscaping service, with a few aging trucks and annual revenue that didn't even reach $500,000. He had a few dozen clients, mostly local homeowners, and a handful of small office maintenance contracts. The staff numbered barely over a dozen, mostly manual laborers who worked on a simple routine. Take orders in the morning, finish by evening, and go home. The whole operation ran on my father's years of experience and the dedication of a few loyal men like Michael, the foreman who had been with him since the very beginning. But when I looked at the business, I saw something else: enormous potential. The market was growing, office parks and upscale residential developments were springing up all over the Dallas, Fort Worth area, and the demand for quality landscaping services was skyrocketing. The problem was, my father never thought about expansion. He was content with a few $100,000 in revenue, a modest lifestyle, and the belief that one day Anthony would return to carry on the family business. On my first day at the company, my father simply waved his hand and said, "You can help with the office work, learn gradually. This heavy work isn't meant for women." I smiled without arguing. But inside, I already had a clear plan. I hadn't come back just to be some office assistant. I had returned to turn this small company into an empire. Whether my father believed it or not, I would use my own ability to change everything. From the very first days back at the company, I could see how worn down its operations were. Contract files were piled high in rusty metal cabinets, with no digital copies anywhere. The work schedule for the trucks was scribbled across a whiteboard, smudged and easy to erase. Customers had to call in their requests, wait for the secretary to jot them down on paper, then wait again for someone to pass it along to the field manager, which could take days before getting a response. I realized that if we kept working this way, the company would forever remain a small-time operation, unable to compete with the new firms popping up all over Dallas, Fort Worth. So I began restructuring. I spent weeks redesigning the entire workflow, from how we handled customer requests, to scheduling, to staff allocation, to supply management. I introduced project management software, which my father at first dismissed as unnecessary clutter. But after a few months, even he had to admit it reduced mistakes dramatically. I created a maintenance schedule for equipment, instead of waiting until machines broke down to repair them. I required every employee to keep daily work logs so I could track exactly what they did and how efficient they were. To me, these were basic standards, but to my father, they were foreign, since he had always been used to a "we'll figure it out tomorrow" style of management. The greatest ally I had during this time was Michael Torres, the foreman who had been with my father since the days when the company owned only one truck. Tall, sun-darkened, with calloused hands hardened by decades of shovels and machinery, Michael was more than just a supervisor. He knew how to run every piece of equipment, how to talk to clients, how to resolve disputes between workers, how to keep the team standing strong even on 100-degree days. To me, Michael became like a second father, the kind of father who actually knew how to teach and encourage, so different from the biological one who only criticized and belittled me. He often told me, "Isabella, you've got a mind your father will never see. Don't give up. You're on the right track." He was the one who taught me how to operate an excavator, how to check the pressure on a mower, how to read a contract without letting the client take advantage. Many late afternoons, the two of us would sit on an empty lot, me studying and taking notes, him sharing hard-earned lessons. What I learned from Michael wasn't written in any textbook, but it became the bedrock foundation on which I built everything else. Another person who came along and transformed the face of the company was Sophia Nguyen. Just a few years older than me, Sophia was a Vietnamese-American landscape design engineer who had recently graduated from the University of Oklahoma. I met her at an industry seminar and immediately recognized her potential. Sophia had a refined aesthetic sense and a modern design approach, turning plain plots of land into vibrant, livable spaces. I convinced my father to bring her into the company, though he hesitated at first, saying, "Hiring more people is too expensive." But after Sophia's very first project, a rooftop garden for a boutique hotel in downtown Dallas, he had to nod in agreement, admitting the company had never produced anything so impressive. From then on, Sophia became my creative right hand, while I focused on management and expansion. Our partnership practicality and creativity combined pushed the company into a new era. I began targeting large commercial contracts instead of just small residential lawns. I prepared proposals, knocked on the doors of property management firms and luxury housing associations. At first, many turned us down, doubting that a small family company could handle projects worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But I was persistent. I invited them to tour our completed sites, showed them our processes, our performance metrics. I built a professional portfolio for the company, something we had never had before. After 6 months, we secured our very first commercial contract. A $250,000 project to renovate the landscaping of an office complex in Plano. When we delivered on time and under budget, the client immediately signed 3 more contracts. From there, word spread quickly, and Romano Landscaping became known not just as a lawn service but as a trusted commercial contractor. For 10 years, I poured 70 to 80 hours a week into the business. I was on job sites at dawn, then back in the office reviewing accounts, drafting bids, and negotiating with partners. I was often the last to leave the yard at night, making sure every piece of equipment had been serviced and was ready for the next day. I had no summer vacations, no parties, no luxury trips. While many of my peers were settling down with families, I spent my weekends crunching costs and writing proposals. But I never regretted it, because every drop of sweat turned into tangible results. Revenue climbing from a few 100,000 to 1 million, then 2 million, and by the 10th year, we hit $5.5 million in annual revenue. From a company of just 12 employees, we had grown to 80, with a brand new fleet of trucks and contracts stretching across 3 states: Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. Meanwhile, my father appeared mostly at important meetings to sign documents or pose for photos with major clients. Anthony was even worse, occasionally dropping by the office in a sharp suit, tossing out a few management buzzwords he had picked up somewhere, then disappearing again. But when the local press wrote articles praising the company's rapid growth, they still called it the Romano family legacy. My father stood before the cameras, smiling with pride, while I stepped back, my heart in turmoil. I didn't crave personal fame, but each time I saw them taking credit for what I had built, a bitter ache rose inside me. I knew that sooner or later, the truth that I was the one who had built this empire would have to be acknowledged. Michael often looked at me, gave my shoulder a firm pat, and said, "Isabella, don't let it discourage you. Results will speak for themselves. People can claim the name, but no one can take away the skill and the reputation you've built." Sophia encouraged me in a different way. "Don't worry, sis. Everyone knows who's really doing the work. I'm here because I believe in you, not them." Those words kept me steady, pushing the company forward, waiting for the day when the truth could no longer be hidden. Anthony's presence in the company I had built was like a guest visiting a home and acting as if he owned the place. He always chose the busiest moments to appear, often during staff meetings or right after we signed a major contract. He would smile, pat my shoulder, and say things that, on the surface, sounded supportive. "Isabella, you've really done great. The company has grown so much thanks to you." But behind closed doors, when it was just him and my father, his words were entirely different. Anthony began planting the idea in my father's mind that I was only fit to be an executor, while leadership, strategy, and expansion, the grand decisions, belonged to men. I had no idea about those private conversations, only that something in my father's tone toward me began to shift. If before he had been silent or dismissive when I reported results, now he slipped in comments that unsettled me. "You're talented, but do you think far enough ahead? One day, this company needs a man at the helm. Big clients prefer dealing with men." At times he was more direct. "No matter what, Anthony is the true heir. A daughter will marry and leave. The company can't stay with you forever." Each time I heard those words, my heart grew heavy, but I reassured myself that he was simply clinging to old cultural habits, that time and results would eventually change him. Anthony, meanwhile, played his part flawlessly in front of me. Whenever he stopped by, he would put on a show of admiration. "You work so hard, sis. I really admire you." Once, I even overheard him boasting to friends in the conference room. "My sister works like a man, never takes a break." Naively, I thought it was rare praise, not realizing he was actually using the image of me as a woman working like a man to underline how abnormal I was, hinting that I didn't belong in that role. He constantly whispered to my father that I lacked leadership qualities, that employees obeyed me only because I pressured them, not because they truly respected me. My father, already fixed on the idea that a company must be run by a son, gradually nodded along. The irony was that Anthony had never done real work. He didn't understand machinery, had no grasp of operations, and knew nothing about managing a job site. But he excelled at polished words. He memorized management jargon from short courses, strategic vision, business model innovation, modern human resources management, and poured them into my father's ears as if he were a born leader. My father, who rarely placed trust in women's intellect, was swayed by that hollow language. I didn't realize that every point I made in meetings was later twisted by Anthony when he retold it to my father. "Isabella is good at execution, but she doesn't understand strategy. She should handle the practical side, and let your son take charge of leadership." Meanwhile, I continued to throw myself into the work, believing the numbers spoke for themselves. Revenue soared, commercial contracts grew larger, clients returned eager for more. I kept telling myself, no one can deny this truth. But what I hadn't anticipated was that in my father's eyes, truth could be bent distorted by prejudice and by the manipulation of the son he treated as his treasure. Once, I proposed expanding into Louisiana after securing a potential partner. I presented the plan with excitement, laying out the costs, the roadmap, the projected profits. The key staff all agreed. But after a private meeting with Anthony, my father called me in and said, "I think expanding that far is too risky. Women like you sometimes don't see all the dangers. Men have a different perspective." I was stunned, unable to understand how, in the span of a single conversation, he had turned 180 degrees. Later, I learned that Anthony had whispered, "She's too ambitious, father. Be careful she doesn't take reckless risks. The company could be in danger." The more I achieved, the more wary my father became. He began requiring me to seek his approval before signing major contracts, whereas before, I had full authority. He repeated often that Anthony will soon be joining the company full-time, a prospect I dreaded. Even though Anthony had no concrete plans, my father believed that he has a natural gift simply because he's a man. Meanwhile, I, the one who had worked tirelessly for 10 years, was slowly pushed out of strategic decisions. My mother saw it all, but all she could do was sigh. She once whispered to me, "Isabella, you must prepare yourself. Your father will never change." In his mind, this company is an inheritance that must go to his son. The more successful you become, the more he feels he has to reassert Anthony's place. Her words pierced me, but I still refused to believe things could ever be that bad. I thought that if I just kept proving myself, eventually my father would have to acknowledge me. But I didn't realize the truth had been decided long ago on the very day I was born, with a gender that did not match my father's expectations. So I kept working, kept hoping, while Anthony patiently waited for his moment. And then, the day finally came, the day my father publicly chose, handing everything to him, while I was left as nothing more than a hardworking woman. I had no idea that the family schemes had been woven long before, only waiting for the right moment to explode. It was a Monday morning when I received an urgent meeting notice from my father at the apartment in downtown Houston. When I walked in, Anthony was already there, lounging comfortably on the sofa, legs crossed, swirling a glass of wine as if he were the rightful owner of the place. I hadn't even taken a seat before my father cleared his throat, his expression stern but carrying an unusual finality. He said there was something important to announce, something concerning the future of the company. My heart pounded in my chest. For years, I had been waiting for this moment, the moment when my father would finally acknowledge my contributions and trust me with the leadership role I had proven I deserved. But what came out of his mouth struck like a cold blade. "All company shares will be transferred to Anthony. You are a daughter, and one day you will marry. You cannot carry this responsibility. Anthony is my only son. The duty belongs to him." I froze, unable to believe what I was hearing. A decade of sacrifice, sleepless nights, contracts I had personally secured, days I had thrown myself onto job sites in 100-degree heat to keep deadlines on track, all erased, simply because I had been born a girl. I turned to Anthony and caught the triumphant smile spreading across his face, the smile of someone who had been pampered his whole life and was now handed a treasure he had never shed a drop of sweat to build. Anthony leaned forward, his voice syrupy but dripping with disdain. "You can still work for me, Bella. I'll let you keep the CEO position. No one denies you have skills, but leadership, vision, that belongs to men." His words landed like a sentence passed down in a courtroom. In their eyes, all I was capable of was being an employee in the very company I had built with my own hands. I turned to my father, hoping that at the very least he would hesitate, that he might soften in the face of the undeniable truth that this company was my creation. But his eyes were cold as steel. "You should accept this. Life is not fair. Anthony is the son, he must take responsibility. As for you, you work well, so continue, but ownership, never." It felt as if I were plunging into a bottomless void with nothing to hold on to. Images flashed through my mind in a blur. Me at 22, returning to the company with bloodied hands but hopeful eyes. Me at 27, staying up countless nights drafting the expansion plan into Oklahoma, me at 30, standing at the signing of our first $1 million contract. My heart racing with pride, knowing I had lifted the company to new heights. All those versions of me were extinguished in an instant by a few curt sentences from my father. Anthony, of course, seized the moment to pour salt into the wound. He turned toward me, his voice tinged with mock sympathy. "Don't be upset. I know this must be hard to accept, but try to look on the bright side. At least you won't have to carry the heavy burden of responsibility. You can still focus on what you're good at, and the long-term vision, leave that to me." I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my skin, my insides torn between fury and despair. I wanted to scream that he had never managed a single project, never once borne responsibility for this company a single day in his life, but I held back. I knew that no matter how loud I shouted, my father would never hear me. The air in that apartment was thick, compressed, suffocating. My father stood firm, Anthony smirked, and I felt like a stranger in my own family. And then I understood, it wasn't that my father couldn't see what I had done, he saw everything. But for him, the truth mattered less than preserving the prejudice that the company must be inherited by a son. He chose to erase my work, just to uphold a false tradition he mistook for honor. I stood up, feeling the whole room spin with each pounding heartbeat. I spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "If that is your decision, then there is nothing more for me to say." Then I turned and walked out of that luxurious apartment, each step heavy, but carrying within me a new clarity. In the empty hallway, I heard Anthony's voice echo behind me. "Don't worry, sis. I'll help you get used to your new role." His tone was like another slap to my dignity. What neither he nor my father realized was that in that very moment, a chapter of my life had ended, the chapter where I still sought recognition from them. I drove back to Dallas through a haze of choked anger, the long road stretching endlessly. When I finally reached my apartment, I threw my keys onto the table and sank into the sofa, trying to take a deep breath, but my chest felt unbearably heavy. In my mind, my father's cold voice and Anthony's smug smile kept replaying. "You are a daughter, and one day you'll marry. You cannot carry this. Anthony is my only son. The responsibility belongs to him." I knew then that if I stayed in the company, I would be nothing but a shadow, an employee inside the very house I had built. I picked up the phone and called my mother. The moment I heard her say, "Hello," I broke down in tears. She listened silently as I poured out every word caught in my throat, from my father's decision to Anthony's attitude. When I finally finished, I heard her own sobs on the other end. She said, "Your father will never change, Isabella. He has lived his whole life trapped in that mindset. You have to save yourself. Don't let your hard work be buried under their shadow." Her words cut me like a blade, but also sliced through the darkness inside me like a beam of light. I sat there, quiet, then whispered, "I understand, Mom. I won't wait for them anymore." The truth was, I had been preparing for this moment for years. I knew one day my father would do something unjust, and I would have to walk away. Over more than a decade of work, I had saved nearly $200,000 money from bonuses, from the small share of profits my father allowed me to keep, and from my own frugal living. I didn't drive luxury cars, didn't buy designer bags, didn't spend recklessly like Anthony. I chose a modest life, saving for the future, so that if the day ever came when I was forced out of my own company, I would still have the foundation to start again. It wasn't just money I had prepared, I had also quietly built relationships with clients. I was always the one directly managing projects, always the one they called when problems arose. I kept every line of communication, checked in after each season of work, and sent thank you notes during the holidays. I knew the clients trusted me, not my father, and certainly not Anthony. That was the greatest capital I carried with me. The very next morning, I met Michael at a small cafe. He took one look at my devastated face, and after hearing only a few words, he slammed his hand on the table. I knew it. I knew he would do this. They've been blind for too long. Isabella, you can't let them steal your work like that. If you branch out, I'll go with you. I've given my life to that company, but I know who really built it into an empire. And it wasn't Anthony. Then he gripped my hand firmly, his eyes burning with conviction. That afternoon, I called Sophia to the small temporary office I had rented downtown. After listening to my story, she sat in silence for a moment, then gave a bitter smile. I knew this would happen sooner or later. I've heard the way Anthony talks about you behind your back, but don't worry. If you go independent, I'll follow. I want my designs to be placed where they truly belong in a company where real contributions are recognized. Together, we'll create something they could never even imagine. I looked at Sophia and saw in her eyes the same fire that was now raging in my own heart. That night, I sat alone, opened my laptop, and began typing out the first business plan for my own company. I typed the name, Isabella Landscaping Solutions. Simple, but proud. It was no longer Romano, the name my father and Anthony had used to erase me, but my own, declaring that from now on, no one would ever steal my accomplishments again. I outlined a vision. A modern, professional landscaping company expanding across the southern states, a place where every employee would be treated fairly, where women could hold leadership positions without being dismissed. I knew this path would not be easy. I would be competing directly with my old company, where my father and Anthony still held the contracts, the equipment, the crew. But I had something they could never possess: the trust of the clients, the loyalty of people like Michael and Sophia, and above all, an unshakable determination. I swore to myself. One day, my father and Anthony would have to watch as Romano Landscaping collapsed, while Isabella Landscaping Solutions rose to become the name everyone in the industry spoke of. And when that day came, I wouldn't need to say a single word. The results would speak for me. I threw myself into the work as if rest had never been an option. The first day of Isabella Landscaping Solutions began inside a small office I rented in an industrial building on the outskirts of Dallas. The space was barely 800 square feet, with low ceilings and walls that still smelled of fresh paint, but to me, it felt like a pure beginning. On my desk, I placed a small wooden plaque engraved with the name of the new company, and I sat there staring at it for a long time. For the first time in my life, I saw my name not just tied to Romano, but standing alone, solid on the desk, like a declaration. This is my work. No one can ever take it from me again. Michael and I started making calls to old clients, the managers of office complexes, upscale residential communities, the people I had worked directly with for years. I didn't hide anything. I told them plainly that I had left Romano Landscaping, that I had started my own company, and that if they chose to continue with me, I promised to maintain the same quality and even improve it. The response left me stunned. Most of them agreed immediately. Richardson, the manager of the entire office complex in Plano, said outright, "Isabella, we work with you, not your father or your brother. Wherever you go, we'll follow." Within just 2 weeks, I had secured commitments from over half of the company's largest commercial clients. Meanwhile, Sophia threw herself into creating the logo and building the new brand identity. She spent countless nights sketching and refining drafts before presenting them to me. In the end, we chose a design that was simple but powerful. The word Isabella in green, with a curved line beneath it suggesting fertile soil and flowing water. When that logo was printed on trucks, embroidered on uniforms, and featured on brochures, pride swelled in me like a rising tide. This was not just a company, it was proof that women could lead in an industry long thought to belong only to men. During the first 2 months, I hardly slept. By day, I met with clients, signed contracts, and went out to job sites with Michael and the crew to ensure deadlines were met. By night, I stayed in the office with Sophia, revising our portfolio and preparing bids for new projects. Some nights, we ate cold pizza under fluorescent lights, our eyes red from exhaustion, but still laughing because we knew every line we typed, every number we calculated, was another brick laid in the foundation of a new empire. And the results came faster than I had imagined. Within just 2 months, Isabella Landscaping Solutions had won back more than 60% of the commercial contracts from Romano. Not only that, we also secured new clients thanks to word of mouth. a chain of shopping centers in Oklahoma City, a real estate group in Little Rock. The growth was so rapid that even I was stunned looking at the reports. From a tiny office, we now had steady cash flow, enough to support 25 full-time employees, many of them skilled workers who chose to leave the old company to follow me. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, Anthony was sinking into chaos. My father had handed him full authority, but the truth was he had no idea how to manage. In the very first month, 2 industrial mowers broke down because they weren't maintained properly, delaying work at an office complex. Employees complained about disorganized schedules and late paychecks, while Anthony busied himself hosting strategic orientation meetings in the air-conditioned conference room sessions full of flashy buzzwords no one could understand. Gradually, the skilled workers began to leave. Some came to me for jobs, others went to competitors. Rumors started spreading throughout the industry. Romano Landscaping was dying. Suppliers complained about late payments, clients grumbled about declining quality. I heard that during a meeting with the management board of an Arlington complex, Anthony was grilled about why the grass was overgrown when the contract clearly required weekly cuts. He fumbled, blaming it on unpredictable weather, which made the entire room burst into bitter laughter. Day by day, the gap between the two companies grew wider. On one side stood Isabella Landscaping Solutions, smaller but tightly run, with loyal clients and a reputation that soared. On the other was Romano, bigger in appearance, but hollow inside, disorganized, and rapidly losing credibility. I didn't need to strike directly. All I had to do was focus on doing things right, and clients abandoned them on their own to come to me. Some nights, I drove past the old Romano company yard. A place that once buzzed with the sound of engines and workers calling out to one another now sat in darkness, only a few broken trucks scattered in silence. I would stop my car, looking through the fence, and a strange feeling rose inside me. It wasn't just the satisfaction of victory, it was sorrow too. So many years of my effort were poured into that ground, so many drops of sweat soaked into that soil, now abandoned in the hands of someone unfit to lead. But then I gripped the steering wheel tighter and reminded myself, don't look back, keep moving forward. The road ahead belongs to you. The early days of building my company were grueling, but that first breakthrough showed me something crystal clear. When you build on trust and genuine hard work, you don't need to worry about losing it. People will follow you, not just a name. From that moment, I knew with certainty that Romano's collapse was only a matter of time. One rainy afternoon, Maria Lopez, the accounting assistant at Romano, came to see me. Her hands trembled as she placed a thick stack of files in an old binder in front of me. Her voice broke as she spoke. Isabella, I can't stay silent any longer. I've worked for Romano Landscaping for nearly 10 years, but what Anthony is doing is unbearable. This is everything I've managed to save. He set up shell companies under the names of acquaintances and used them to siphon money. I've even been ordered to retype invoices with amounts inflated by double. I'm scared of being implicated, but I trust you. I flipped through the papers, my heart pounding. Bank statements revealed clear irregularities, tens of thousands of dollars transferred regularly into Romano Supply LLC, a company that, when checked, traced back to an empty apartment on the outskirts of town. Invoices for printing and materials showed signs of tampering, and several small suppliers had no idea contracts were being signed in their names. I knew I couldn't hesitate. I contacted James Carter, a seasoned commercial lawyer who had helped me register my new company. That very evening, James sat with me and Maria in the modest office of Isabella Landscaping Solutions. He turned page after page, his eyes sharp and cold. Isabella, this is clear evidence of financial fraud and tax evasion. If we back this up with more banking data and sworn testimony, Anthony won't escape. For the next 2 weeks, James and I worked day and night. We combed through every expense, every old contract. I reached out to several suppliers I knew, and they confirmed they had never received the inflated amounts listed on the invoices. Some former employees, encouraged by Maria's courage, also began stepping forward with more information. One technician recounted how Anthony had ordered him to sign off on a phantom equipment shipment worth over $100,000, when in reality only a fraction had been purchased. Another manager testified that Anthony often demanded cash payments from clients under the guise of offering a discount, only to pocket the money without recording it in the books. James compiled everything into a comprehensive legal dossier. I remember vividly the morning we walked into the district prosecutor's office. The building was imposing, with high ceilings and an air of gravity. James laid the heavy binder on the desk. I remained silent, nerves trembling inside me but with a core of resolve. The prosecutor flipped through the first pieces of evidence, then looked up at me. "Miss Romano, are you prepared to testify? You understand this case could stretch for months, even years." I drew a deep breath and answered firmly, "I'm ready. I don't want anyone else deceived or exploited." No. The very next day, the IRS joined the case. They demanded the full accounting records of Romano Landscaping. A warrant was issued to search the company's office. Word began to leak out. A federal investigation into financial fraud in the landscaping industry in Texas was underway. At first, Anthony tried to act smug. He posted on the company's Facebook page, claiming it was all baseless rumors spread by malicious competitors. But when federal agents froze the company's bank accounts and IRS officers started combing through the office files, the color drained from his face. The remaining employees were in a state of panic. Some called me, asking if they could apply for jobs at Isabella Landscaping Solutions. I couldn't take everyone, but those I knew to be truly decent and dedicated, I welcomed with open arms. That night, I sat alone in my small office, the warm yellow lamp casting light across my desk. I thought of my father and of my mother's tearful words on the phone. "You must save yourself." And now I realized, I wasn't just saving myself, I was saving others too, from Anthony's cruelty and greed. The official investigation began, and for the first time in years, I felt justice drawing near. News of the probe spread like wildfire. At first, just a few lines in the local Dallas paper, but soon bigger outlets picked it up. CNN, the New York Times, even financial networks like Bloomberg ran stories about the downfall of Anthony Romano, a man once introduced as a rising young entrepreneur, the poster child of a new generation. That morning, I sat in my office with attorney James Carter, watching the live news broadcast on the wall-mounted television. The screen showed a fleet of FBI vehicles, economic crime investigators, and IRS agents entering the Romano Enterprises building. Men in black suits and sunglasses strode briskly with briefcases, while others in jackets stamped FBI, Financial Crimes Division carried evidence boxes. Inside the building, chaos reigned. Romano employees stood stunned, some trembling as boxes of files were hauled away and computers sealed with evidence tape. The cameras caught the moment Anthony, dressed in an expensive gray suit, was handcuffed in the president's office. His face was ashen, his eyes darting with a mix of rage and terror. The headline blazed across the screen. "Young Dallas entrepreneur arrested for $400,000 financial fraud." The city was shaken. On social media, the hashtag number Romano fraud spread like a virus. Old articles once praising Anthony were dug up and reposted, now covered with mocking comments and derision. As I watched, my heart felt both heavy and at peace. For years, I had been compared, belittled, cast aside by my own father in favor of Anthony. And now, the truth was laid bare before the entire world. Anthony wasn't a business prodigy. He was nothing more than a fraud, a hypocrite exposed. That evening, I received a call from my father. For the first time in many years, his voice trembled, broken by tears. "My daughter. I was wrong," he choked out. "I trusted the wrong person. I was blind, putting all my faith in Anthony, and now everything has collapsed. I've lost it all. You were the capable one, the one I should have believed in from the beginning." I bit my lip, gripping the phone tightly. For so many years I had waited to hear those words, but now that they came, I felt nothing. Only a cold emptiness. I answered quietly, "Father, I tried to prove myself. I tried so many times to make you see me. But you never listened. Now it's too late. On the other end, I heard his heavy sigh, the muffled sound of him crying, but no tears came from me. The love I once had for him had died long ago. The case went to federal court only a few months later. I sat beside attorney James Carter through the hearings. Anthony sat at the defendant's table, still trying to hold on to his arrogance, though his eyes were hollow, sunken with fatigue. His lawyer argued desperately that it was merely accounting errors, that Anthony had never intended to commit fraud. But the evidence we presented was undeniable. Dozens of falsified invoices, tampered ledgers, offshore accounts, and emails with suppliers arranging kickbacks. The federal prosecutor stood, voice steady and precise. This is not an error. This is organized fraud, carried out over years, for personal gain, causing significant losses to shareholders and damaging public trust in the market. The judge listened, his expression grave. After many rounds of arguments, the verdict was delivered. Anthony Romano was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to repay over $400,000 in restitution. In that moment, Anthony collapsed into his chair. My father sat behind him, his face blank, his hair turned white in just a few short months. I looked at them and felt no triumph, only finality. After the trial, the fallout consumed my family. Romano Enterprises was dissolved, its assets seized to cover debts and restitution. The houses, the villas, the cars, all of it was auctioned off, one by one. My father, once a proud man driving luxury cars and attending lavish parties, became penniless. He had to leave the mansion in the Dallas suburbs and rent a shabby apartment to live in. Images of his downfall spread online, with people whispering, "That's karma." Some old friends turned their backs. Those who once flattered him now acted like they had never known him. My father fell into a mental spiral. He came to me many times, begging for forgiveness, hoping for my help. But I only shook my head. "Father, I spent my whole youth seeking your recognition, and in return, you never believed in me. Now, I can't go back." People asked me, "Do you regret letting your father collapse like that?" I stayed silent. The truth is, I felt neither glee nor triumph. What I felt was relief that the truth had finally come out, that justice had taken my side. And yet, deep down, a wound remained. The bond between father and daughter had never been healed. If only he had listened, if only he had believed in me, perhaps things could have been different. But life doesn't deal in ifs. My father paid the price for his blindness. Anthony paid the price for his greed and arrogance. And I, at last, stepped out of the family's shadow and became myself strong and free. The months that followed felt like stepping into an entirely new chapter of my life. The company I had poured my soul, sweat, and tears into was no longer a fragile startup. Within 2 years, our revenue reached $8 million, a figure so high that even I sometimes struggled to believe it. We expanded beyond green building design into urban planning and public park maintenance. Our projects were trusted first by the city of Dallas, then Austin, and eventually Houston, turning my name into that of one of the most recognized young entrepreneurs in the industry. Every time I signed a new contract, I remembered my father's words. "You're just a girl, don't dream too big." Those words once cut into me like a blade, but now they had become the very fuel that drove me to prove him wrong. On this new journey, I was no longer alone. David, the man I am now engaged to, came into my life just when I needed the strongest shoulder to lean on. He didn't love me for my success or recognition, but simply because he saw the real me, a woman who had been hurt yet never stopped fighting. He often held my hand and said, "You don't have to push yourself to prove your worth anymore. To me, you're already enough." For the first time in my life, I felt unconditional love. Together, we made plans to build a peaceful home, free from favoritism, comparison, and control, the kind of family I never had growing up. Some nights, looking out the window of my apartment at the glowing city lights, I would wonder, if my father had believed in me back then, would I have grown this strong? If Anthony hadn't betrayed me, would I have dared to step out and build my own empire? And I realized that betrayal, in the end, was the greatest gift. It pushed me out of my comfort zone, forced me to break through, and proved that I was worthy. My father now is no longer the man he once was. After Anthony's conviction and the seizure of his assets, he lost everything he once took pride in. He called me once, his voice trembling. I was wrong. You were the capable one. If only I had believed in you from the start. I stood silent for a moment before replying softly. It's too late now, Father. But I hope you find your own lesson in this. When I hung up, I felt no satisfaction, only peace. I no longer needed that belated recognition because I had already found my worth long ago. Looking back on the journey, I understood this. The sweetest revenge isn't tearing others down, it's living better than they ever imagined, succeeding beyond what they thought possible, and showing them everything they lost through their blindness, selfishness, and prejudice. And this is what I want to leave with those listening to my story. Never let anyone tell you that you are unworthy simply because you are a woman. Never believe that gender decides your ability or your future, because sometimes it is precisely the doubt, the belittlement, and the condescending looks that become the fire that propels you further than anyone ever expected.